Okay, and now in this bonus video I want to share with you another approach to rendering your grayscale values, but with a much more precise approach. This approach makes use of paths in the Paths panel in Photoshop. So if you're using another application, first check to see if there is a separate Paths panel, and then also research whether or not the paths in your application allow you to save the paths a variety of ways, and find out if you're able to save the paths and load them as selections, because that's the technique I used here. Think back to the geometric forms that we practiced on and how we were able to use selections, save those selections as alpha channels, and then after that we could paint into those selections by loading them again. Well, we're going to use a similar technique. You're going to see a similar approach here. Let me go ahead and hide those little targets there. We don't need them. Make the extras go away. So here's the layers panel for this file, and I'm going to go ahead and show what I have so far. So hiding everything except for the background, or except for the sketch first. So the sketch just came right out of one of my smaller sketchbooks, and you can see this is a kind of a sci-fi vehicle of some kind. There are some hard-edged lines going all the way around it. It's somewhat sketchy, but the contour lines give you an idea of the overall form. There's a cockpit. There are some parts that look like maybe engines or wings. There is a kind of a front to the vehicle, and a little suggestion of a cast shadow or some sort of a light source hitting the object maybe from above. This is what the artwork looks like with some digital paint applied on top of it. The values still need a little bit of massaging, but this is where I stopped. I've also duplicated that bottom layer, and I just wanted to show you that sometimes it's helpful to do a couple things here. Here in my lines layer, I have two sets of lines. One set of lines was done or created using the paths that I'm going to show you in a little bit, and they are pixels. So I could potentially go in and choose these here, and let's say I wanted to have maybe a heavier edge down at the bottom here, but then have the edge up here at the top sort of fade off into that lighter value. Well, with the eraser tool, I can simply go in and erase those lines. I'm going to change the settings here. Maybe the lines that are hitting the top edge, so that when the light kind of hits that part, you won't see that edge, but I now have a line down to bottom to sort of emphasize the underside of that part of the vehicle. Similarly, I might have some, if this part is somewhat, if it may be coming out of or kind of intersecting with this other piece, I can play with the shape of that line. So that line was created by stroking, by applying a stroke with a paintbrush to one of the paths that I saved. Okay, so just trying to simulate what happens when we have a really thin occlusion shadow happening along the surface of the vehicle. Just erasing that out a bit. There's that spacing setting again. Okay, same thing back over here. I might shave off some of that edge just to show the transition from one form to another. Probably don't need that edge down here at the bottom. And you can see I'm going to have to go in and do a little bit of painting down there. That's okay. And then same thing over here, light side, so I don't need that edge anymore. And I could proceed, all the way across the vehicle to either delete and erase or keep those lines that I added using the paths feature. Okay, what's next? Well, I also have a duplicate of the artwork that I started with. So I'm going to be creating the shadow in a later video. I'm going to be creating the shadow by loading a path that I use to trace the shadow from the sketch. But some of these other textures and details, I could possibly just kind of keep them there on their own layer and then maybe scrub them a little, make that one active. So I'm calling this layer line texture. And if I just kind of go in there and start pushing what was originally my pencil marks around, maybe I can introduce just a hint of weathering on the surface of the vehicle. Okay, maybe whoever is in the cockpit, there might be just a little suggestion of there being some, either a person in there or some devices. Maybe it's a drone of some kind with but still has some instruments. Maybe this is some kind of a sensor array for the dome. Who knows? So applying a little bit of smudging here to just add a little bit of interest, a little bit of texture around the vehicle. Okay, and then, in addition to that, I have a colors layer. In the colors layer, I have a layer that's just used to kind of tweak the lighting, so to speak. It is a gradient map, therefore that gradient is mapping a blue to the shadows and a yellow to the highlights. I can always go in and play with this setup, maybe make the yellow less saturated and brighter and warmer. Maybe I can go in down here and make the blue also less saturated and maybe even a little bit cooler. Okay, so Command Z, that's what I had before. There's an adjustment. Here is the artwork without that. So I can have this really bright, punchy, almost anime style effect, or I can use a layer on top to, with a little bit of opacity reduction and changing the blend mode, I can have that do something different. This is what the feature looks like at 100%, just laid on top. It's just going to replace all those colors with the colors from the gradient map, all those values. So switching over to color, and then reducing the opacity, I can get some interesting mixing happening there. Okay, so there's still room, to go in and start, maybe creating some highlights, maybe make some adjustments to how some of these fills behave. You notice that I'm using a new one here. I'm using linear burn. Compare that with something like multiply, which is going to allow some of the darker values to peek through. So you can always go in and explore these different blend modes for the layer to see which one is to your liking. Okay, back to linear burn. I like the intensity of that. I could play with its opacity, maybe allow some more of the gray to peek through, and then the yellow. And setting things up this way lets me change my mind. Maybe I want this to be more of a teal color. Okay, kind of change it up a little bit. And this is being applied to two parts of the vehicle. I'm going to take this back and I'll do a little bit of surgery on this one. I'm going to take my brush, paint with white into that adjustment layer, take this up to 100. Just wait for it. And see if I can do a little bit of freehand painting here. But if I want to contain that stroke, here's what I have. In my paths panel, I have a large stack of vector-based paths that were saved. With this flyout menu, there is a save. If I had a a work path. So this one here, which is nothing. But if I had a path there, I'd be able to save that path and then give it a name. And once I have it in there, it can also be loaded. Let's see if I can find the name of this one. I think that's the wingtip. So I'm going to do a command click, and now the wingtip portion is loaded. Deselecting, command D. The wingtip path looks like this. When I click on it, you can see the path itself. This is a vector-based path, and I can use the vector-based tools in Photoshop to select and edit, either draw more anchor, add more anchor points, or modify the paths themselves. So I am creating vector-based paths for many different parts of the vehicle. This is a hard-edged, vehicle. So everything from the overall silhouette to the cockpit to the canopy itself, the glass part, the engines, this front part, which I'm calling the hood, and so on. All of these were drawn or captured using the pen tool. I even added one for the shadow, which you can see down here. So if I can get to a point where I'm ready to load the shadow, but subtract, command option click, subtract out part of the silhouette, which is the whole outer shape of the vehicle, then I'm ready to go into my render layer, my grayscale render layer. I'm going to unlock the transparent pixels, get my brush out, get a big brush, and maybe have it kind of a medium gray, and just paint into it. Nice thing about this feature is that I even have the option, Command D, deselecting, I even have the option of applying a, how would I do that actually? I'm not sure. There's something called a feather I mentioned a while back. I think I showed it to you when we were looking at saving selections. How could I apply a feather to this one? I'm not sure how. So never mind. I'm going to load this again. So right now, the only method I know of for softening these edges would be to take the eraser tool, set it to a hardness of 0, get a large brush going, lower its flow and its opacity, and just give a light dusting along the edge. But I have a feeling there might be a way to set this to give you a softer edge automatically with feathering. I'll have to research that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and deselect. Have kind of a rough shadow thrown in there. If I want to add some more painterly effects, I can just get out my smudge tool, use an appropriate brush, and maybe I'm going to, let me drop that strength down a bit. Just give it a little push. And some scumbling. Maybe some directional scumbling up and down. Try to make it look like it's in motion even though it's standing still. Why not? Okay. I also have some backgrounds here. So I have a gray background that lets me view the artwork just as a gray. I can also see that there's a little bit of a flaw up here at the top. Something happened with my rendering for my red fill layer. So back to my brush tool, I can open up that layer mask for that color fill layer just by painting with white. Or the issue could be that I need to just go into the grayscale layer and take my eraser tool and get rid of those. This is a guess. Okay, I'm not sure where those are coming from. They are on that layer. I just confirmed that. So with my eraser, taking up everything up to 100, maybe now it will cooperate. Hardness at 100. And let's get rid of these little extra boogers here. Okay, a little bit of a mismatch with the panels there. Same thing with this one. I probably don't want any red, so I'm going to hit X. Go to the red fill. I'm going to hide that little bit there. Back over here, eraser tool. And so on. I'm showing you this technique so that you are aware of the fact that you can achieve an even higher level of detail, but it takes more time, more planning, and some familiarity. If you're going to use this technique, some familiarity with the pen tool. There are lots of tutorials available for free from Adobe, so just do a search for Illustrator Pen Tool or Pen Tool in Photoshop. Look for tutorials that will let you practice with the tools. That's really important. The pen tool is one of the least kind of user-friendly tools out there. It takes a lot of practice. There are some strategies for using it, but if you start on the wrong foot with your learning for the pen tool, you're going to have problems probably for the rest of your life as long as you're using it, the application. So try to find some really good training for that, and you should be happy. Okay, so as you can see, I could spend a lot of time here, just doing some surgery on my color fill adjustment layers, how I'm rendering these different parts, what's getting colored, what isn't. And when all of that is done, I can still go over everything with an additional layer and possibly start to introduce a new layer. I could start to introduce maybe some sort of highlights brush tool. That will be weathering. All right. If I want white and black for the foreground background color, I'll just hit D. Okay, maybe there's a little sparkle there. Maybe this leading edge also has something similar going on. All right, so think it through, do some planning if you want to take on something with this level of complexity. And I think it's also beneficial to see how you can start with a sketch. And just through being very careful and methodical, you can build that sketch up into something fantastic, something with a lot of detail and complexity, a certain level of realism. It's totally possible. In industry, if you're thinking like the entertainment industry, Photoshop is still probably the leading, if not it is one of the preferred digital painting mediums out there. Pretty much everyone paints in Photoshop. For manga and comics, I think it's kind of a toss-up between Photoshop and Clip Studio Paint. In fact, the first demonstration of Clip Studio Paint that I saw was given by the artist who illustrated the original Watchmen series, Dave Gibbons. This was at the old Apple Store when it was on Market Street in San Francisco. They had that really nice little auditorium there. And he was also demonstrating on his Cintiq and just showing a little bit about his process. Okay. All right, so I just want to show you another approach. So same concept, it's just using these saved paths as a way of isolating different areas in order to paint them with a much sharper edge rather than trying to get all of those crisp edges by painting freehand. Okay. Learn to love the pen tool, learn to appreciate it, practice with it so that if you are faced with the possibility of doing something like this, you're going to be able to just dive right in, put the time and energy into it, and not be afraid of it. Okay, so I'll stop the video here. I might end up adding a little bit more to this before sharing the file, But I think there's enough information here for you all just to study the file and practice these techniques. You can probably render it, to a level that you're happy with. So feel free to play with it. And that's it for this video.